Hi everybody and welcome back. I know it has been a minute, and that is not because nothing has been going on around here. Quite the opposite actually. But the thing is, I actually started making a video about the last pieces of the rust repairs on the van. And somewhere in the middle of it, I realized I am really fed up with rust repairs. And I'm pretty sure you are fed up about watching it as well. I mean, my last 3 videos has been all about rust repairs. So instead of making another one of those, I thought I will do a quick update video just to show you where I'm at with the van and my plans forward. And I'm sure there will be some rust repairs in this as well. Well, let's have a look at the van. This is where I'm at right now. I know it looks pretty sad without the doors and the windows and all that, but look at these new panels right here. No more rust. I still have a few tiny places that needs to be welded in, but overall I'm done with the rust repairs. Actually, let's talk a bit about those patch panels, because most of them actually turned out to be way harder than I first thought. I started with the panel right next to the side cargo barn doors. Since this looked to be mostly a straight piece, I thought it would be easier to start with, instead of starting with the back corner or something that looked way harder. But boy was I wrong. But more on that later. I used one of these profile gauges to find a shape that I then rolled into a piece of sheet metal. So far so good, except that my rubber band wanted to constantly slip off. I then tipped the edge with a bead roller and finished it off with a hammer and dolly. It's kind of hard to see, but the body actually has 2 sharp bends at the bottom, so I sent it through the bead roller once again. I marked the location for the body line and double checked it against the other side just to make sure I got it in the right spot. I then used the bead roller to put it in using my custom 3D printed dies. If you saw the video where I fixed my floors, you actually saw me use my own 3D printed dies. And they actually worked really well. Sure, you can see that they have been used, but they held up perfectly for the whole floor. And for this body line, I printed a new set, and that has worked equally as good. I mean, it's crazy how much money you can save by printing your own dies. But it's somewhere around here my problem started. I needed the panel to bend upwards in order to meet the lip or flare or whatever you want to call this. I tried rolling it in the English wheel. Impossible. I then went at it with a mallet and a sandbag. That worked, but I just couldn't get the top part of the panel to fall in, or whatever you want to call it. I tried stretching, I tried shrinking, but I just couldn't get it to where I wanted. So I ended up calling it a day, and I sat down to do some research in order to understand what it was that I was actually trying to achieve. And it turns out that the thing I wanted was something called a reverse curve. And it's when a panel goes both like this and like this. And as it turns out, that is one of the hardest things you can do in metal shaping, and even skilled metal shapers struggle with it. So my easy panel turned out to be my hard panel. Well, the way that you create a reverse curve is by stretching the edges and leaving the center, or if possible, even shrink the center a bit. And that gave me a perfect reason to bring out my old friend, let's see, Mr. Hellhammer. If you're into Norwegian black metal, you know who Mr. Hellhammer is. And if you hear this hammer, you will know that it is both fast and loud, and it definitely creates mayhem. It's actually quite simple. All it really is a cheap air hammer attached to a bit of rebar, and then I have this pedal to control it. And right here I have my own homemade stretching dies. And I did actually design it so I can change the dies, but so far I have only made one die, and that is this stretching die. And yes, this is very much inspired by Carl Fischer's creations. It looks pretty rough, but it actually works great. With my newly stretched panel, I went ahead and cut out the rotten part, only to find even more rotten parts that I also cut out. I quickly made some small pieces and welded them into place. With those welded in place, I mounted my new panels using Clecos. And you've probably heard about Clecos before, but if you haven't, they are really awesome. They come from the aircraft industry and they are perfect for holding pieces of sheet metal together temporarily. You just drill a hole and put them in. I then marked the lip, rolled it in the bead roller and cut off the extra metal. I then welded it into place, and here's the result. It turned out looking pretty decent for being my first kind of advanced patch panel. But the thing I didn't know at the time was that I would end up redoing half of the panel later on. But don't worry, I won't bore you with that. Let's move on. I then move on to do the back left corner, and this whole corner was actually totally malformed. But a sledgehammer and a crowbar fixed that. I then made a masking tape template of the right corner in the hopes of being able to reproduce it, but inverted of course, for the left corner. The template actually fit pretty well, so far so good. I hammered out the basic shape and then went on to create the dimpled hole. I figured it was easier to do that now rather than later, but this kind of ended up biting me later on. I made the whole thing with an angle grinder, hammer, dolly and an adjustable wrench. And it turned out pretty sweet, I think. And the rear bumper would cover it all up in the end anyways. I then rolled it to make it a bit prettier and tested it on the van. Everything checked out, so I moved on to roll the bottom flange. Here I had to move back and forth between the bead roller and the kick shrinker. And I finished it off with a dolly and hammer. I then pulled up my custom bodyline dies again, and this is where my dimple hole bit back. I couldn't get the dies past the flange, so I had to do the last bit with a hammer and dolly. I welded that panel into place and then continued working on the piece that will continue along the left side. And that is basically a reverse curve, once again, kind of similar to the one we just did. So why don't we just speed through it with some nice music. It's almost time to look at the final result, but first we have one more panel to make, and that's the front left corner. It's quite similar to the rear corner, but I actually had to make a new tool to make it work. But let's talk about that when we get there. Music!
Don't need no jacket, shelter from the storm. she's with me, lifting off the ground. She keeps me next to her like I'm the only one around. Oh, how she loves me, picks me up and takes me high.
And here's the new tool. It's a tucking fork. Once again, very much inspired by Carl Fisher, and once again, made out of rebar. You might start to see a pattern here. I really like to make tools out of rebar. It's just so nice to work with, it's cheap, and it's available everywhere. Anyway, the tucking fork is used to create tucks into the metal that you then can hammer out to shrink the metal. It's really effective to do a lot of shrinkage in a short amount of time. And it doesn't really mess up the panel the same way as the kick shrinker does. The next item on my DIY to-do list might actually be a shrinking stump. It would be really fun to try one of those. I did end up doing some kick shrinking on the panel as well, so it did get a bit messed up. But that's okay, I can sand some of it out, the rest can be covered with filler, and in the end the front bumper will cover it all up. Okay, that's all the panels. Let's take a look at them. I've been doing some grinding on the welds as well, and in some places it needs a bit more welding, and in a couple of places it needs a bit of filler. But for what it is, I'm really happy with the end result. 100% good enough, to quote Carl Fisher. The next step is actually a really exciting one, and that is paint. But that will have to wait for the next video. And hopefully you won't have to wait quite as long for that video as you did for this one. But thank you so much for sticking around, and thank you so much for watching, and I will see you later. Bye!